Hey internets, so recently Second Thought came out with one of the silliest takes on the mainstream media I have seen in quite a while. Here's the video in case anyone thinks I'm being dishonest about it or misrepresenting him. You can watch it yourself in that case. Also, I will be doing this response video as a gamer rant with some heckin' Fumo racing because A, this doesn't really require much visual aid to understand, and B, I need to make sure I am giving this particular take from Second Thought the extreme level of seriousness that it deserves. Anyways, I'll start out with a quick paraphrase of what he said. Basically, he names a bunch of right-leaning media such as Fox News, PragerU, or the Daily Caller and their donors or other financial sources of financial backing such as the Koch brothers, as well as seething over a few influencers like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro. He then uses this data to paint a picture that the mainstream media empire exists to push right-leaning propaganda by starting from the argument that no amount of similar money is being used to fund pro-socialist media. Now the problem here, of course, is that his reasoning is completely ridiculous. I, as an Austro-libertarian Hoppe enjoyer, could easily make the exact same argument for the right in reverse by cherry-picking out MSNBC or the New York Times or the Washington Post and some left-leaning billionaires who often provide financial backing to liberal media, such as, George Soros or Mike Bloomberg and whatnot, and then I could then, of course, make the exact same video that Second Thought made, using the exact same biased reasoning that he used, but while painting the exact opposite picture and pointing out that the amount of funding that the Mises Institute gets pales in comparison to what these guys are shoveling. And then, of course, further cherry pick by saying this guy donated to that organization, or this organization funded this guy's campaign, and yada yada yada, and they sent $200K here, and this guy sent $1 million here, and so on and so forth. But it wouldn't mean anything, because as it turns out, cherry-picking is a fallacy and not honest reasoning. Of course, I'm not going to make that video. Why? Because again, that's completely ridiculous reasoning. If you want to honestly answer the question, where does mainstream media influence generally lean politically and what direction is it going towards, you wouldn't try to calculate this from your own political position, unless you yourself are a centrist. No, you would obviously need to look at the top watched mainstream news sources and then average the data out based on the center. And then you could start to build a model that paints a more accurate picture. And of course, you would also want to properly account for the fact that the center itself has moved, unlike that one insanely stupid study that Vox tried to push. So in order to properly refute what Second Thought was saying, I'm going to do just that. Let's honestly, sincerely this time, answer the question of where the mainstream media generally lies on the political spectrum and what direction their influence seems to be swimming in. Now, before I even get into the data behind this, I'm just going to be totally frank here though. Anyone born in the 1980s or earlier who has not been living under a rock kinda already knows that it has been swimming left. I'll just be real for a moment. You can compare what we remember from those times to today, and to even try to imply otherwise is nothing less than just pure gaslighting. But let's look at the data anyways, because some of it actually is pretty interesting, and while Second Thought's video may be silly, the topic itself is a serious, important question. And just anecdotally saying, oh, I'm old enough and wise enough to remember otherwise, is really just my lived experience, and we all know that's not exactly a good argument. Or it's generally just not a complete argument, would be another way to put it. Let's start with some Pew Research data from the last decade. First off, it shows that there's more news media sources that are trusted by those who are on the left. There are double the mainstream sources that are consistently liberal and have a trust score of over 50% than those that are consistently conservative. People who lean towards the right in general do not trust the mainstream media as much, which just further gives you a hint of which direction the media leans, based on the audience that they attract, because obviously they need to pander to some kind of audience. The research plotted on a left-to-right spectrum graph also shows that we are seeing a clear center-left bias based on where most of these media sources and their audiences lie, when of course we are comparing the most-watched conservative-leaning sources and the most-watched left-leaning sources, as opposed to, just cherry-picking one of them, because again, that's completely ridiculous, dishonest reasoning. And the fact that we have a center-left bias in the media really shouldn't surprise, well, anybody. Again, if you've been paying attention at all over the last 50 years, this is pretty easy to spot. And this conclusion of there existing a center-left bias in the media has also been reached by various other sources. For instance, when we go by Ad Fontes media chart, we can also see the biggest cluster seems to be having a center-left leaning bias. Or how about we check out Media Bias Fact Check? Again, the largest amount of results appear in the left-center bias. And again, does this really surprise anybody? As I've said before, we, for the most part, live in a liberal, mixed-market society. which means that the establishment is going to be controlled by that ideology, and of course the media is going to largely reflect that ideology, as most influence will generally reflect where the power is coming from, as it always has done in pretty much the history of human civilization. But of course this alone is not a complete story. As I said before, we need to also further account for where the center has moved. And yes, I know, again, if you have not been living under a rock, then you probably already know the answer to this question. But seriously, let's take a look at the data anyway. And this is where we start getting into the data that reflects what we would call the cathedral, or just a shorthand way of saying journalism plus academia, as mentioned by Curtis Yarvin. I did an entire video on that, on what it really means, and just a basic analysis of it. You can watch it if you want, but the basic idea is that there's a decentralized collusion that tends to kind of come down into the area where most of the power and influence concentrates. This results in a decentralized narrative collusion where people who wish to seek prestige and rank within the inner circles of academia and mainstream journalism end up aligning themselves with the most popular ideological components within these institutions in order to, again, seek prestige and rank, but also to mask their lack of ability to form their own unique opinions or critically examine how these institutions behave from the outside. As far as where academia lies, I could go into pretty extreme detail of that, but there's a very easy way to see that, and that's a study where it shows that only 2% of sociology professors will openly identify as conservative or right-leaning. In fact, interestingly enough, you are more likely to find an open Marxist-Leninist sociology professor than you are to find one that is even just right-leaning. And you certainly are not going to be finding any Austro-libertarians there. These kind of statistics would be basically impossible if there was not at least some kind of left-leaning bias in these institutions. Now, as far as the cathedral goes, currently it has been very much been swimming leftwards, also known as Cthulhu swims left. Now, one thing I do disagree with Curtis Yarvin on is that I don't believe that Cthulhu always has to swim left. He can swim right later in the future perhaps, but in the last 50 years or so, it has been, for the most part, swimming left. And this is, well, pretty much just an uncontested fact. And this is why Second Thought's implications are just so utterly ridiculous. The mainstream media has been overwhelmingly doubling down on various lefty progressive talking points over the last few decades. And so for him to play the victim here when the media is clearly swimming more towards his side anyways, makes absolutely no freaking sense whatsoever. This is just a classic case of victimhood and projection. And if you want to further know where the center has moved, again, you could just look at what a centrist on average believes in the 1990s and compare them to today. Or even better, or even funnier I should say, is compare your average Democrat from the 1990s and compare them to today, and you will find that their positions very closely mirror what conservatives are saying today. Again, just tying into the running joke that a lot of boomer conservatism is just Democrats minus 20, 30, or 40 years or so. At least as far as United States Republicans versus Democrats goes. Which, by the way, if you want to see something really funny that emphasizes this, just look up Bill Clinton's State of the Union address in 1995, where he goes into illegal immigration. The Democratic Party's positions on illegal immigration and border walls back then almost completely mirror what Trump Republicans are now pushing today. Just a particularly silly example that shows just how completely insane it is to try and imply that these parties and political affiliations have not moved left in general. But also, what about financial influence? Second Thought did mention lobbying and following the money, so let's take a moment to go ahead and do just that. But instead of cherry-picking organizations and their funding, which happens to share a particular ideology that I personally don't agree with, the more honest move here would of course be to use a more neutral source. For instance, the list of top lobbying contributors from Open Secrets, which shows that Democrats received about $5.6 million from the top federal lobbying contributors, and the Republicans received about $3.4 million. Once again showing a clear center-left bias, at least from the point of view of American politics. Oh, and let's not even get started on where Hollywood and theater factor into this equation of influence. They have been basically doubling down on leftist Prague intersectional identity politics for the last decade, and the evidence for this is again overwhelming to the point where I probably don't even need to cite it because it is self-evident to anyone paying attention, but just in case you do need some empirical evidence on this, here's a little picture, and I'll cite the source on the bottom in the description below, and you can check it out if you really want to, and if you just gotta look at that data. But really, again, it's pretty obvious to anyone who has not been living under a rock. But also, on that subject of wokery and DEI, some may recall my last video on ESG scores and BlackRock. Yeah, so you want to complain about a few $1 billion of Koch brothers money? How about the trillions of dollars of assets under management of the firms like BlackRock and Vanguard, which they have been pushing to be based on DEI standards that have been baked into ESG? And how about the fact that they're lobbying for those various ESG standards to be pushed into law? Perhaps you might want to mention that. And this is what really makes Second Thought's implications and conclusions from his cherry-picking so incredibly deceptive. If you understand the logical conclusions of DEI, you know that they ultimately progress on the political spectrum towards an authoritarian left position, aka closer to Second Thought's position. So what exactly is he complaining about then? That right-leaning media just exists? Does he just not like the fact that it exists? Is that what's going on here? Is it just a covert anti-free speech rant? And that's one of the saddest things about BreadTube in general. They are trying so very hard to LARP as anti-establishment, but they can't do it because said establishment has been occupying a lot of their talking points more and more with each passing decade. And lefty prog identity politics, of course, in the media has essentially been the establishment's go-to psyop for manipulating the minds of the normies since the early 2010s. So instead of citing more neutral data like I just did, they have to make these completely ridiculous mental gymnast videos where they only focus on the part of the data that agrees with them, and then they hope that you are dumb enough to not take a step backwards and look at the bigger picture. It's a massive grift. Don't fall for it. But for now, that's all. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, leave a comment, and all that algorithm stuff. Till next time.